In 1946, in the rubble of what had once been Berlin, a woman named Margarete Hoffmann stood in front of a destroyed apartment building and made a decision that would change the course of her life and unknowingly help reshape an entire continent. She had nothing. No husband, he'd been killed on the Eastern Front in 1943. No home, it had been reduced to ash and twisted metal. No money, no job, no prospects. She had only her 2 children, ages 7 and 9, and a determination born from the animal instinct to survive. She looked at the wreckage around her and thought, someone has to rebuild this. Someone has to clear this rubble. Someone has to make something from nothing. Why not me? Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. She was not alone in this thought, though she didn't know it yet. Across Europe, in the aftermath of the most devastating war the world had ever seen, millions of women were standing in the rubble of their former lives and asking themselves the same question. What now? What happens to women who have lost everything? What happens when the men are gone, or broken, or unable to imagine a future? What happens when the infrastructure of civilization collapses and someone has to pick up the pieces? The history books don't talk much about this moment. They talk about the Marshall Plan, about American aid, about the wisdom of political leaders in rebuilding Europe. They talk about the infrastructure projects and the economic policies and the diplomatic negotiations. But they don't talk about the women. They don't talk about the women who actually did the rebuilding. The women who, when faced with a continent in ruins, rolled up their sleeves and got to work. The women who had no choice but to become the architects of recovery. The women whose labor, whose ingenuity, whose refusal to give up, literally rebuilt Europe from the ground up. This is their story. Not all of their stories, there were millions, but some of them. The stories of women who emerged from the wreckage of war and became the backbone of European reconstruction. Women who were not celebrated by history, whose contributions were often rendered invisible or attributed to men, but whose work was absolutely essential to the survival and recovery of the continent. Margarete Hoffmann's story begins in darkness. Not metaphorical darkness, but actual darkness. Berlin in 1946 was a place of profound physical darkness. The Allies had bombed the city systematically, and what remained was a landscape of destruction, unlike anything most people had ever seen. Entire neighborhoods had been flattened. The buildings that remained were skeletal walls standing with no insides, windows empty like eye sockets. The streets were filled with rubble, mountains of bricks and concrete and twisted metal that had once been homes and offices and schools and shops. Margarete had survived the bombing. She and her children had been in a basement when the bombs fell in 1945, and through luck or fate or the mercy of probability, the basement had held. But luck doesn't feed children. Luck doesn't rebuild homes. Luck doesn't create jobs or restore infrastructure or rebuild a city. She started by doing what seemed most obvious. She began clearing rubble. This was work that had to be done. Tons and tons of rubble had to be moved, sorted, categorized. The brick could be salvaged and reused. The metal could be melted down. The rest had to be hauled away. It was backbreaking work. It was work that destroyed your hands, filled your lungs with dust, left you in constant pain. But it was work, and in 1946 Berlin, work was survival. She was not the only woman doing this. In fact, as time went on, it became clear that women were doing most of this work. They were called Trümmerfrauen, rubble women. Young women and old women, former housewives and former teachers and former shopkeepers, all of them standing in the rubble of their destroyed city, moving bricks. Some historians estimate that there were about 400,000 rubble women in Berlin alone. Across all of Germany, The number was in the millions. These were women who had no men to support them, or whose men were dead or disabled or imprisoned. These were women who had to figure out how to feed their children and keep a roof, however makeshift, over their heads. The work was difficult and dangerous, but it was also transformative. For many of these women, it was the first time they had been the primary earner, the main builder, the person responsible for reconstruction rather than just maintenance. For many of them, it broke open possibilities they hadn't considered before. It made them understand that they were capable of more than they had been told women were capable of. Margarethe worked for several years as a rubble woman. She worked alongside hundreds of other women, clearing debris, sorting materials, literally rebuilding the city brick by brick. She was paid, though not much, but enough. Enough to feed her children. Enough to rent a room in a building that still partially stood. Enough to survive. But as she worked, she began to think about something else. She began to see opportunities. She began to understand that there was a shortage of building materials, and that materials that had been waste could be reclaimed and sold. She began to see that organizations and individuals were desperate to rebuild and were willing to pay for access to usable materials. She began to have an idea. Around 1948, Margarethe made a transition. She stopped being just a rubble woman. She became a salvage coordinator. She organized teams of women to clear specific buildings in specific ways. She figured out systems for sorting and storing materials. She began to manage contracts with construction companies that wanted to rebuild. She became, in effect, a small businesswoman operating in the rubble of Berlin. This was not something she had planned to do. It was not something she had been trained for. But it was something that needed to be done, and she was capable of doing it, and so she did it. Her story was not unique, though it was perhaps more dramatic than most. What was unique was that she documented it. Years later, she would write about her experience, and her writings would be discovered by historians interested in the role of women in post-war reconstruction. But at the time, she was just one of millions of women across Europe who were figuring out how to survive and, in the process, figuring out how to rebuild. The story of European reconstruction is not the story of the Marshall Plan, though the Marshall Plan was important. It's the story of women who went to work. Women in France and Italy and Poland and Greece and every country that had been devastated by war. Women who had to figure out how to do the work that had previously been done by men, because the men were gone or dead or unable. Women who discovered in the process that they were capable of building economies, not just maintaining households. In Warsaw, which had been almost completely destroyed, a woman named Zofia Kawecka became an architect of reconstruction. Before the war, she had been a teacher. She had no formal training in engineering or architecture, but during the war, she had worked in the Polish resistance, and she had learned to think strategically, to plan, to problem solve in impossible circumstances. After the war, with the city in ruins and a desperate need to rebuild, she began consulting on reconstruction projects. She worked with government officials and construction companies to develop plans for restoring the city. She was not given an official position. She was not hired as an architect. But she was consulted. She was asked her opinion. Her ideas were taken seriously. And over time, her contributions to the rebuilding of Warsaw became substantial, even though she was never formally recognized for it. This pattern repeated itself across Europe. Women who had no formal credentials stepping into roles that had previously been occupied by men because the situation demanded it. Women who proved they were capable. Women whose contributions were essential to survival and reconstruction. Women who were often rendered invisible or forgotten by history. The Marshall Plan, which began in 1948, was ostensibly about providing American aid to rebuild Europe. And it did that. But the aid was not enough by itself. The aid could pay for materials and for some workers, but the actual rebuilding, the physical work of reconstruction, had to be done by Europeans, and much of that work was done by women. In Italy, particularly in Naples and southern Italy, women became central to rebuilding efforts. Naples had been devastated by bombing, and the reconstruction was slow and difficult. Women worked in construction, worked in factories being rebuilt, worked in infrastructure projects. They worked as laborers, as foremen, as coordinators. They worked in fields that had previously been exclusively male. One woman in particular, Rosa Caputo, became known for her work in coordinating reconstruction efforts in her neighborhood of Naples. She was not a politician or an official. She was a widow with 4 children. But she became the de facto organizer of reconstruction in her area. She coordinated work crews. She negotiated with government officials. She made sure that materials were distributed fairly and efficiently. She was, in many ways, the backbone of her neighborhood's recovery, and yet she was never formally recognized or compensated for her work. This, too, was a common pattern. Women doing essential work without formal recognition or compensation. Women understanding that their labor was necessary for survival, and so they simply did it, even though they received no official credit. But something else was happening too. Something more subtle, but perhaps more profound. Women were gaining skills. Women were learning about construction and engineering and logistics. Women were gaining confidence in their ability to do work that had previously been considered the domain of men. Women were discovering that they were not fragile or incapable. They were discovering that they were strong. And in many cases, women were discovering that they preferred this. That work that was challenging and meaningful, and that produced visible results, was more satisfying than the domestic work they had been expected to do before the war. That having financial independence and the ability to make decisions about their own lives was preferable to dependence on a husband. In France, a woman named Simone Beauvoir was documenting these changes while they were happening. Beauvoir was a philosopher and writer, and she was interested in the question of women's liberation. She was observing the changes happening in society as women entered the workforce and remained there, even as men returned from war. She was seeing women who had discovered that they could do work that had previously been considered impossible for them. And she was beginning to think about what this meant for women's freedom and women's potential. In 1949, she would publish The Second Sex, a groundbreaking work of philosophy that would examine, in part, the role of women in society and the possibility of women's liberation. Though the book is often read as purely theoretical, it was grounded in the concrete reality of what Beauvoir was observing, women who had been forced by circumstance into roles of power and labor and who were discovering what they were capable of. The second sex did not emerge from abstract theorizing. It emerged from watching millions of women across Europe prove, through their actions, that they were capable of doing anything that men could do. It emerged from watching women rebuild civilization from the ground up. Across Europe, in country after country, the pattern was the same. Women entered the workforce because it was necessary. Women proved themselves capable. Women began to imagine different possibilities for their lives. Some of these women wanted to continue working after the war ended and the men came home. Some of them wanted to leave the workforce and return to domestic life. But the point was that they had a choice now, or at least the possibility of a choice. They had skills and experience. They had proven their capability. They had money in their own hands. They could not be so easily put back in a box. The governments of Europe recognized this to some extent. There were debates about what to do with the women who had entered the workforce. Some officials thought women should be pushed out to make room for returning soldiers. Some thought women should be encouraged to stay because the economies needed the labor. The answers differed from country to country, but the fundamental tension was the same. In Germany, Margarete Hoffmann continued her work in salvage and reconstruction through the late 1940s and into the 1950s. As Berlin began to rebuild more formally, her salvage operation became something more substantial. She hired more workers. She formalized her contracts. By the early 1950s, she was running what could reasonably be called a construction material recycling company. She was employing dozens of people, mostly women. She was managing large projects. She was, in many ways, a successful businesswoman. And yet, she faced constant discrimination. Banks were reluctant to lend to her because she was a woman. Government officials treated her with a kind of patronizing kindness, as if she were a child playing at business rather than a serious operator. She was not permitted to bid on certain types of contracts. She had to work twice as hard to prove her credibility. But she persisted, and her success was visible. Her contribution to the rebuilding of Berlin was tangible. The materials she salvaged went into thousands of buildings. The jobs she created allowed hundreds of women to survive and support their families. Across Europe, in the 1950s, as countries continued to rebuild and as economies began to grow, women's participation in the workforce became more normalized, though it remained contested. Some women were pushed out of the jobs they had held during Reconstruction. Some were encouraged to stay. Most navigated a complicated landscape where they could work, but where they faced discrimination in wages, in advancement, in social acceptance. But the point was that they could work. They had proven themselves capable. And that capability could not be undone, even if it was not always welcomed. In Czechoslovakia, a woman named Helena Zmekalova became a manager in a textile factory. Before the war, this would have been unthinkable. But during and after the war, with the country rebuilding and with a desperate need for skilled workers, women were brought into management positions. Helena proved herself capable. She became respected in her role, and she remained there, managing the factory until her retirement decades later. She never became famous. She never appeared in history books. But she spent 30 years building and managing a productive enterprise that employed hundreds of people. Her contribution to the reconstruction and ongoing development of Czechoslovakia was substantial and real. In Greece, which had been devastated by war and occupation, women became crucial to reconstruction. Particularly in the countryside, where much of the population lived, women had to figure out how to rebuild homes and fields and agricultural systems. They had to become farmers and builders and managers of resources. They had to become, in many ways, the foundation of rural recovery. One woman, Maria Papadopoulos, became known in her village for her skill in organizing reconstruction efforts. She coordinated the rebuilding of homes. She managed communal work parties. She figured out systems for sharing resources and labor. She became, in effect, the organizer of her village's recovery. And her village did recover, and it thrived, because she understood how to organize collective effort toward shared goals. These stories, Margarethi's, Sophia's, Rosa's, Simone's observations of women's changing role, Helena's, Maria's, they were being repeated in different forms across Europe. Thousands of stories. Millions of individual women figuring out how to survive and, in the process, rebuilding their countries and their continent. But the official history of Reconstruction often missed these stories. The official history told the story of the Marshall Plan and the brilliant American economists who designed it. It told the story of political leaders making wise decisions. It told the story of economic recovery and industrial production. It told the story of men returning from war and resuming their roles. It did not tell the story of the women who had kept things alive during the war, who had literally and figuratively cleared the rubble, who had been the invisible backbone of Reconstruction. This began to change somewhat in the 1970s and beyond, as feminist historians started to research and document the role of women in Reconstruction. But even now, the full story is not well known. Even now, most people do not understand the extent to which European Reconstruction depended on women's labor, women's ingenuity, women's determination to survive and rebuild. One reason for this erasure is institutional. Records were often kept in ways that made women's contributions invisible. If a salvage operation was registered under a woman's name, but all contracts were signed by male representatives, the records would reflect the male representatives. If a woman managed a factory, but the official records listed only the owner, the manager would be invisible. If women did the actual work of reconstruction, but men were the official engineers or architects or planners, the women would not appear in the official history. Another reason is cultural. There was a strong post-war desire to return to traditional gender roles. Even as women's contributions to reconstruction were essential and visible, there was a pressure to return to a pre-war model where women were primarily in the domestic sphere. This pressure came from government, from the church, from families, from society at large. And with this pressure came a kind of social amnesia about what women had done and what they had proven themselves capable of. The official narrative became, women worked during the war and Reconstruction because it was necessary. Now that things are returning to normal, women can return to their proper sphere. This narrative erased the fact that many women did not want to return. This narrative erased the fact that women had discovered new possibilities for themselves. This narrative erased the fact that women's labor had been essential, not exceptional. And yet, despite this pressure, despite this erasure, women's role in European society continued to change. Women had entered the workforce and had proven themselves capable. Even if some women were pushed out of jobs, other women entered. Even if women were discouraged from seeking advancement, some women persisted. Even if women's contributions were not officially recognized, those contributions had real effects. Women had changed. Society had changed. And those changes could not be completely reversed. By the 1960s, as European economies had rebuilt and begun to grow, women's participation in the workforce continued to expand. The women who had fought for survival in the rubble of 1946 were not going back. They had shown themselves and their societies what they were capable of. And a new generation of women, informed by their mothers' and grandmothers' examples, began to push for more opportunities, more recognition, more equality. The feminist movements of the 1960s and 1970s did not emerge from nowhere. They emerged from the concrete experience of women who had proven, through their own labor, that they were equal to any task. They emerged from the memory of women who had rebuilt civilization. They emerged from the understanding that women were capable of more than society had traditionally allowed. In this sense, the rebel women of 1946 were not just rebuilding Europe. They were laying the groundwork for the feminist movements that would transform European society in the decades to come. They were proving, through their actions, that women could do anything. And once that truth was proven, it could not be forgotten, even if it could be temporarily denied or suppressed. The question of what happened to these women after Reconstruction is complicated and varied. Some, like Margarethe, continued in business and became relatively successful. Others were pushed out of their jobs or chose to step back from the workforce. Some remained in the workforce but found themselves occupying lower positions, lower wages, less recognition than their work deserved. Some became involved in political and social movements. Some simply tried to live normal lives, raise families, and recover from the trauma of war. But all of them carried with them the knowledge of what they had done. They had rebuilt Europe. They had proven themselves. That knowledge could not be taken away, even if it was not always celebrated. One of the most interesting aspects of the Reconstruction period is how women's networks operated. While the official structures of Reconstruction were often male-dominated, informal networks of women became crucial to actually getting work done. Women knew other women who needed work. Women knew other women who had skills. Women knew other women who needed materials or had access to materials. An informal economy of women helping women emerged, which was essential to survival and reconstruction. These networks often operated outside official channels. They were based on friendship, kinship, mutual aid, and reciprocal obligation. A woman would help her sister find work. A woman would pass along information about available materials. A woman would introduce another woman to someone who needed her skills. This informal economy was not unique to Reconstruction. Women had been operating this way for centuries. But Reconstruction made it more visible and made it more essential to economic survival. In some cases, these networks became formalized. Women's cooperatives emerged in various countries, where groups of women would pool resources and labor to accomplish Reconstruction and economic goals together. These cooperatives were not always successful, and they faced discrimination and difficulty in accessing capital and markets. But they represented an attempt by women to organize themselves and to maintain control over their labor and its fruits. In Italy, agricultural cooperatives formed by women became important sites of economic organization and mutual support. In Scandinavia, women's cooperatives in various industries became established features of the economic landscape. In Eastern Europe, particularly in countries under Soviet influence, women's associations became important sites of social organization, though they were often controlled or co-opted by the state. The point is that women across Europe were not just passively participating in Reconstruction. They were actively organizing themselves. They were creating institutions and systems. They were figuring out how to pool resources and manage collective efforts. They were becoming, in many ways, the economic organizers of their communities and countries. This organizational skill, this ability to create systems and manage resources, would become important in the political and social movements that emerged in the following decades. The women who had learned to organize work crews and manage salvage operations would become organizers of feminist movements and labor movements and other social movements. The skills they had learned in Reconstruction would be applied to other struggles for justice and equality. The story of European Reconstruction is, in many ways, the story of women learning that they were capable of anything. It's the story of women discovering that they could manage resources, make decisions, direct labor, and build economies. It's the story of women finding their voices and their power in the rubble of what had been destroyed. And it's the story of a society that, faced with the choice of recognizing and celebrating these capabilities, chose instead to largely forget them. Even as women's participation in the workforce continued and grew, even as society became more open to women in various professions, the specific history of women's crucial role in Reconstruction was largely erased from official narratives. This erasure is not unique to Europe or to Reconstruction. It's a pattern that repeats throughout history. Women do essential work. Women prove themselves capable. And then, when the crisis passes, women's contributions are downplayed or forgotten, and efforts are made to return to a previous status quo where women's work was less visible and less celebrated. But history cannot be completely erased. The evidence remains. The buildings built and rebuilt contained the labor of women. The economic systems that grew out of Reconstruction were built, in part, by women's efforts. The social changes that followed were informed by women's experience of capability and equality, even if temporary and imperfect. In the decades following Reconstruction, as European countries grew richer and more developed, women continued to enter the workforce and continued to push for recognition and equality. The rebel women of 1946 had daughters and granddaughters who would not accept the traditional limitations placed on women. They would push further. They would demand more. They would build on the foundation that their mothers and grandmothers had laid. Margarethe Hoffmann's salvage business continued into the 1960s. By then, Berlin had been substantially rebuilt. The rubble had been cleared. The immediate crisis of Reconstruction had passed. Her business became less essential, though it continued. She never became a household name. She never appeared in official histories of Berlin's Reconstruction. But she had done the work. She had employed hundreds of women. She had salvaged millions of bricks that went into thousands of buildings. She had survived and had created the means for others to survive. She retired in the 1960s and lived quietly for the rest of her life. She died in 1982 at the age of 85. Her funeral was attended by many of the women who had worked, for her who remembered her as the person who had given them work when they needed it, who had shown them they could do more than they had imagined. Her story is not unique, but it is illustrative. It shows the trajectory of one woman who faced impossible circumstances and who figured out how to not just survive, but to create, to build, to lead. It shows what women were capable of when circumstance forced them to be capable. The question that haunts the history of Reconstruction is, what if women had been given full recognition for their work? What if the societies being rebuilt had looked at the capabilities women had demonstrated and decided to build new systems based on equality rather than falling back on old patterns of hierarchy? It's a counterfactual, and counterfactuals are not history. But it's worth considering. It's worth thinking about what Europe might have been if the rebel women of 1946 had been celebrated and their capabilities recognized. If the governments and institutions rebuilding Europe had said, "We see what women can do. We see that women are capable of leading, managing, building, creating. Let's build new systems based on this reality rather than on old assumptions about what women should do." Would this have happened? Probably not. The patriarchal systems and assumptions that had been in place before the war were too entrenched. The desire to return to what was considered normal was too strong. The psychological need to restore familiar hierarchies after the chaos of war was too powerful. But the point is that it didn't have to be that way. The capabilities were proven. The alternative existed. The fact that society chose not to take that path is a choice, not an inevitability. In the decades that followed, as women continued to push for equality and recognition, they were, in many ways, pushing for what the rebel women had already proven, that women were capable of doing anything. The feminist movements of the 1960s and 1970s were not arguing for something new. They were arguing for recognition of something that had already been demonstrated. This is often how social change happens. First, women prove through their actions what they're capable of. Then later, movements emerge to demand recognition and equality based on that proven capability. The rebel women proved their capability in the 1940s. The feminist movements of the 1960s and 1970s were, in many ways, demanding that society finally recognize what had been proven decades earlier. In Eastern Europe, the trajectory was somewhat different. In countries under Soviet influence or control, women, as participation in the workforce, was often mandated by the state as part of the push toward socialism. Women entered the workforce not necessarily by choice, but because the state demanded it. Childcare was provided by the state. Equality was proclaimed as a principle of the communist system. In practice, of course, gender equality in communist countries was incomplete and complicated. Women often worked and were still expected to do most of the domestic labor. Women often worked in lower-paid positions, despite official proclamations of equality. But the point is that women's participation in the workforce was continuous and was official policy. This had complicated effects. On one hand, women in Eastern Europe had access to employment and education and childcare in ways that women in Western Europe did not. On the other hand, women in Eastern Europe did not have the same legal protections or the same ability to choose whether to work or not. The state's mandate for women's work was not the same as women's liberation, even if it did result in women's participation in economic and civic life. When communism fell, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, one of the changes that happened was a resurgence of traditional gender roles and a push for women to leave the workforce. This was part of a broader restoration of what was seen as normal after years of communist rule. The result was that women in Eastern Europe, who had been working and participating in economic life for decades, suddenly faced pressure to step back into the domestic sphere. This pattern, women forced to leave work to restore traditional gender roles, had happened in Western Europe too, though less dramatically. After World War II, there had been pressure for women to leave the workforce and return to domesticity, even though women had proven themselves capable during the war and Reconstruction. The post-war desire to restore normalcy included a desire to restore traditional gender roles. But in both Western and Eastern Europe, women resisted this pressure, at least partially. Women who had proven themselves capable wanted to continue being capable. Women who had experienced economic independence wanted to continue having it. Women who had discovered new possibilities for their lives did not want to go back to the old ways. The result was that women's participation in the European workforce continued to grow throughout the second half of the 20th century, despite periodic pushes to restore traditional gender roles. By the end of the 20th century, women in most European countries had become a stable and significant part of the workforce. The question was no longer whether women would work, but on what terms. The specific history of the rubble women became less visible over time. It was not taught in schools. It was not celebrated in official histories. Most Europeans did not know about the contribution that women had made to Reconstruction, but the effects of that contribution echoed forward through time. The capabilities that women had proven, the organizations and systems they had built, the skills they had developed, all of these had lasting effects. In the 21st century, as Europe has continued to develop and change, women have become fully integrated into the workforce and into civic and political life, though gender inequality persists in various forms. The trajectory that began with the rubble women of 1946 women proving themselves capable and demanding recognition for that capability continues into the present. One could argue that all of this, the possibility of women participating fully in economic and civic life in contemporary Europe, its roots in the necessity and the bravery of women who faced impossible circumstances in 1946 and figured out how to survive and rebuild. The rebel women may not have been consciously fighting for women's liberation. They were mostly just trying to feed their children and keep a roof over their heads. But in doing so, they were transforming what was possible for women in European society. This is often how social change happens, not through grand movements or conscious plans, but through people doing what they need to do to survive, and in the process, proving that different arrangements are possible. The rubble women did not set out to prove that women could rebuild Europe. They set out to rebuild their neighborhoods and their lives. But in doing so, they proved that women could do the work that had previously been considered the domain of men. And that proof, that lived reality, became the foundation for later demands for equality and recognition. The story of the rubble women is, ultimately, a story about human capability and human resilience. It's a story about what people, in this case, women, can do when they're forced to. It's a story about how difficult circumstances can reveal capabilities that we didn't know we had. It is a story about how proving yourself capable in one domain can lead to demands for recognition and equality in other domains. It's also a story about erasure. It's a story about how significant historical contributions can be forgotten or minimized. It is a story about how the dominant institutions of history-telling can render invisible the work of people who do not fit into the narratives that those institutions prefer to tell. But it's also a story about resilience and persistence. Despite being rendered largely invisible in official histories, the work of the rubble women had real effects. It shaped European society. It enabled the continent to recover from war. It proved that women were capable. And those effects continue to echo forward, informing the possibilities available to women in contemporary Europe. In a sense, every woman working in Europe today, every woman who has the possibility of economic independence and participation in civic and political life, is benefiting from the work of the rebel women. Not because the rebel women did anything specifically for contemporary women, but because they proved, through their actions, that women were capable of more than they had been told. They shifted what was possible. They changed what people believed about women's capabilities. And that shift, that change in belief about what's possible, had profound and lasting effects. Margarethe Hoffmann never became famous. She was never celebrated as a great figure in the reconstruction of Berlin. She never appeared in official histories or received public recognition for her work. But she lived a meaningful life. She survived. She created opportunities for others. She proved that a woman alone, with no resources and no advantages, could build something. She proved that women could do the work that society said only men could do. And in proving that, she contributed to a slow, gradual, incomplete, but real transformation of what was possible for women in European society. She, along with millions of other women across Europe, did the essential work of reconstruction. And in doing that work, they changed European society in ways that continue to reverberate more than 70 years later. This is the story of the widow's market, the market where women who had lost husbands, men, security, and homes came to sell their labor and their skills, and in doing so, discovered that they were capable of building. It's the story of millions of individual women figuring out how to survive in impossible circumstances. It's the story of women becoming essential to their societies, and then often being forgotten for what they had done. It's the story of how women proved themselves capable, even when that capability was not wanted or acknowledged. The rebel women of 1946 were not revolutionary feminists. They were not consciously fighting for women's liberation. They were mostly just trying to survive and to keep their children alive. But they were revolutionaries nonetheless, because they showed, through their actions, that women could do anything. They showed that when women are given the opportunity and the necessity, they will rise to the occasion. They showed that women are capable of building, leading, managing, and creating. And once something has been shown to be possible, it cannot be completely unseen. Once people have proven themselves capable of something, it becomes harder to deny that capability. The rebel women proved their capability in 1946, and even though that proof was often forgotten or minimized in official histories, it remained true. It remained proven. And in the decades that followed, other women would stand on the foundation that the rebel women had built and push for further recognition and further equality. The story of European reconstruction is ultimately the story of women who faced the worst circumstances human society can create: total war, destruction, loss, and who figured out how to survive and rebuild. It's the story of women who proved, through their actions, that they were capable of anything. It's the story of a continent that was rebuilt, in significant part, by women. And it's the story of how that achievement was often forgotten or minimized in the official narratives that followed. But the truth remains. Europe was rebuilt, in significant part, by women. Women cleared the rubble. Women built the infrastructure. Women managed the resources. Women organized the labor. Women proved themselves capable. And that proof, that lived reality, that demonstrated capability, changed what was possible for women in European society. This is the legacy of the rebel women. This is their contribution to European history. This is the story that needs to be told and retold, so that we do not forget what women were capable of, so that we do not forget what women proved possible, so that we understand, in the deepest sense, that women have always been building civilization, even when their contributions were not recognized or celebrated. The widow's market of 1946 was not an organized institution. It was not an official marketplace. It was simply the reality of millions of women selling their labor, their skills, their capabilities in the rubble of destroyed Europe. And in that marketplace, in that arena of necessity and survival, women proved what they could do. And that proof echoed forward through time, shaping the possibilities available to women for generations to come. To understand the full scope of what happened, we need to look at specific moments and specific places where the transformation was most visible and most profound. We need to understand not just that women worked, but how they worked, how they organized, what they built, and what they learned about themselves in the process. In Poland, particularly in Warsaw, the scale of destruction was almost incomprehensible. Warsaw had been systematically destroyed by the Nazis as punishment for the 1944 uprising. Entire neighborhoods had been flattened. The city had been reduced to rubble in a way that was almost total. When the war ended, Warsaw was not a city anymore. It was an archaeological site of destruction. The rebuilding of Warsaw became a kind of symbol of Polish resistance and determination. It was a project with political meaning, and women were central to that project from the beginning. Women cleared rubble. Women worked in newly established factories, producing materials needed for rebuilding. Women managed supply chains and logistics. Women organized collective work efforts. One woman in particular, Halina Schwark, became known as one of the organizers of women's work in Warsaw's reconstruction. She was a former teacher, educated and articulate. During the war, she had been involved in the resistance. After the war, she saw an opportunity to organize women's labor in a way that would benefit women themselves, not just serve the state's reconstruction goals. She pushed for women to be paid fairly for their work. She pushed for childcare to be provided so that mothers could work. She pushed for women to be trained in skills that would allow them to move into better paying positions. She was not always successful in these efforts, but she persisted, and she achieved some victories. More women were paid fairly. More childcare was made available. More women gained skills. What's interesting about Halina's story is that she was not primarily motivated by ideology. She was motivated by practical concerns about women's survival and well-being. But in addressing those practical concerns, she was also advancing a vision of what was possible for women in society. She was arguing, through her actions and her advocacy, that women deserved to be treated fairly, to be paid fairly, to have access to childcare and education. These were radical positions at the time, though they seem basic and obvious now. In France, particularly in industrial regions, women entered factories in unprecedented numbers during Reconstruction. Before the war, women had been largely excluded from heavy industrial work. But during and after the war, women became factory workers. They worked in textile mills and metalworks and chemical plants. They became steelworkers and welders and machine operators. One woman, Therese Mahoney, who was born in Lyon, became a steelworker in the Reconstruction period. She was one of the first women hired at her factory. She faced resistance from male workers who saw women's presence as a threat to their jobs and their status. She faced harassment and dismissal and pressure to leave. But she persisted. She became skilled at her work. She earned respect, at least from some of her co-workers. She stayed in that factory for 35 years, eventually becoming one of the most senior workers there. Her story is illustrative of a broader pattern. Women entering male-dominated industries faced resistance and harassment, but some persisted and proved themselves capable. Their presence changed those industries. It became harder to claim that women were incapable of industrial work when there were women doing that work every day, doing it well, and doing it safely. In Italy, particularly in the Fiat factories outside Turin, women became central to post-war industrial production. The Italian auto industry was being rebuilt, and it needed workers. Women were hired to work on assembly lines and in support roles. By the 1950s, women made up a significant portion of the industrial workforce in northern Italy. They became crucial to the economic boom that northern Italy experienced in the 1950s and 1960s. One woman, Lucia Fontana, was among the first women hired at Fiat after the war. She worked on the assembly line building cars. She was paid less than men for the same work, which was common at the time. But she was working. She was earning money. She was proving, through her work, that women could do industrial labor. Over time, women in these factories began to organize. They formed unions. They demanded equal pay for equal work. They demanded better working conditions. They demanded recognition for their contributions. The labor movements that emerged in northern Italy in the 1960s and 1970s included significant women's components. Women workers pushed not just for better treatment as workers, but for recognition of their capabilities and their rights. This patterned women entering the workforce through Reconstruction, proving themselves capable, and then organizing for better treatment and recognition happened across Europe. It created a foundation for the labor movements and feminist movements of the 1960s and 1970s. Women had proven themselves capable in the workplace. Now they were demanding that society recognize that capability. In Scandinavia, the post-war trajectory was somewhat different. Scandinavian countries had not been as devastated as other European countries, but they still needed to rebuild and restructure their economies. Women's participation in the workforce increased, particularly in public sector jobs like nursing, teaching, and social work. But women also entered other sectors. In Sweden, women's participation in the workforce became more normalized more quickly than in some other European countries. This was partly due to Scandinavian cultural attitudes toward women and partly due to deliberate policy decisions. Swedish policymakers, recognizing that economic growth required labor, actively encouraged women to enter the workforce. Childcare was provided. Tax policy was designed to encourage women's work. The result was that, by the 1960s, women's labor force participation in Sweden was among the highest in Europe. This did not mean that Sweden had achieved gender equality. There was still discrimination and inequality. But it did mean that women's participation in the workforce was more normal and more accepted than in many other countries. And this created a different cultural context for women's demands for equality. It was harder to argue that women were unsuited for work when they had been working for decades and were essential to the economy. The story of European Reconstruction cannot be told without understanding the economic changes that happened. Before the war, European economies had been largely based on agriculture, with industrial production concentrated in certain regions. After the war, as countries rebuilt, they invested heavily in industrial capacity. Factories were rebuilt. New factories were constructed. Manufacturing became increasingly central to European economies. This industrialization required massive amounts of labor. It required workers. It required people willing and able to do the work of building and maintaining industrial production. Women provided much of that labor. Without women's participation in the workforce, the rapid industrial growth of post-war Europe would not have been possible. But women's participation in this industrial production was often invisible. If you look at the official histories of post-war European growth and the economic miracles that happened in various countries, they often focus on technological innovation, on business leadership, on government policy. They do not focus on the millions of women working in factories and fields and offices, doing the labor that made that growth possible. This invisibility is not accidental. It reflects the values and priorities of the institutions that tell history. It reflects a tendency to see innovation and leadership as more important than labor, even though labor is the foundation that makes everything else possible. It reflects a tendency to attribute economic success to male leaders and innovators, even when much of the actual work is being done by women. But the reality remains. Post-war European economic growth was built, in significant part, on women's labor. The factories that were rebuilt and the new factories that were constructed depended on women workers. The goods that were produced depended on women's work. The wealth that was created was partly created through women's labor, even though women often received a smaller share of that wealth than men did. In the 1960s and 1970s, as the women's liberation movement emerged, one of the key issues was equal pay for equal work. Women were doing the same work as men, but being paid less. This was particularly visible in industrial work. A woman working on an assembly line, doing exactly the same job as a man, would be paid less. A woman teaching the same class as a man would be paid less. A woman doing the same secretarial work as a man would be paid less. The demand for equal pay was not just an economic demand, though it was that. It was a demand for recognition. It was a demand that women's work be recognized as having the same value as men's work. It was a demand that society acknowledge that women were doing the same jobs as men and doing them just as well. This demand emerged from the lived experience of women who had been working for decades and who had proven themselves capable. The women who had been rebel women in 1946 were now mothers and grandmothers. The daughters and granddaughters of rebel women were in the workforce, and they had all learned through their own experience and their family's experience that women were capable of doing any work. They had all learned that society's traditional limitations on women were not based on capability, but on prejudice. The pay gap that women demanded to be closed was a concrete expression of a broader demand. Recognize women as capability. Acknowledge that women are equal to men. Stop treating women as secondary workers deserving of secondary pay. Stop treating women's work as less important than men's work. Stop pretending that women are naturally suited to lower status, lower paying positions. These demands were resisted. Employers argued that paying women the same as men would hurt competitiveness. Men argued that women were taking jobs that should go to men, jobs that men needed to support families. Political leaders argued that disrupting traditional gender roles would damage society. Religious leaders argued that gender roles were natural and divinely ordained. But the demands persisted, and gradually, over decades, progress was made. Laws were passed mandating equal pay. Discrimination in hiring and promotion was made illegal. Women's access to education expanded. Women began entering professions that had previously been exclusively male. It was slow progress, and progress was incomplete and uneven across different countries and different sectors. But it happened, and much of the momentum for that progress came from women who had proven, through their own labor during Reconstruction, that they were capable of doing anything that society asked of them. There is also an important story to tell about women who did not enter the industrial workforce, or who chose to return to domestic life after Reconstruction. This is important because it complicates the narrative and reminds us that women's choices and experiences were diverse. Some women wanted to return to domestic life. They had worked because they had to, because they needed to survive and rebuild. But given the choice, they would have preferred to focus on family and home. These women deserve recognition and respect for their choices, even as we acknowledge that choices were often constrained by circumstance and by cultural pressure. Some women had to return to domestic life because their husbands returned from war and expected them to. Some women were forced out of jobs to make room for returning soldiers. Some women chose to stay home to raise children. These experiences were real and are part of the story of Reconstruction too. But the point is that many women did not want to return to domestic life. Many women wanted to continue working. Many women had discovered in themselves capabilities and possibilities that they did not want to give up. And for these women, the post-war pressure to return to domesticity was a kind of theft. It was the theft of the possibilities they had discovered, the work they had found meaningful, the independence they had experienced. Some of these women found ways to continue working despite social pressure. They fought to keep their jobs or to find new jobs. They organized collectively to demand better treatment. They became activists and advocates for women's right to work and women's equality. Others had to give up work, but they carried with them the knowledge of what they had been capable of. They raised daughters and granddaughters with the knowledge that women were capable of working, of leading, of building. They passed on to the next generation the belief that women's traditional limitations were not natural or inevitable, but were social constructions that could be challenged and changed. In this way, even women who did not continue in the workforce became activists for change. They became the mothers and grandmothers who encouraged their daughters and granddaughters to stay in school, to pursue careers, to not accept the limitations that society tried to place on them. They became the foundation for the women's liberation movement, even if they did not explicitly identify with that movement. The story of Reconstruction is also the story of how women learned to organize collectively. During Reconstruction, women developed skills in organization and collective action. They learned how to organize work crews. They learned how to manage resources. They learned how to negotiate with authorities. They learned how to advocate for their interests. These skills of organization and advocacy became crucial in the labor movements and feminist movements that followed. Women who had organized Reconstruction efforts applied those same skills to organizing for workers, rights, and women as rights. The organizational capacity that women developed during Reconstruction became the foundation for social movements that transformed European society. In France, the Confédération Générale du Travail, a labor union federation, had significant women members who had come up through Reconstruction work and factory work. These women pushed the union to take women's issues seriously. They organized around equal pay, childcare, and other issues affecting women workers. They used the organizational structures and tactics they had learned during Reconstruction to advocate for women's rights. In Italy, similar patterns emerged. Women factory workers organized unions. They went on strike for equal pay. They organized women-only meetings and women-focused advocacy. They used the skills they had developed during Reconstruction to fight for recognition and equality in the workplace. In Germany, women as organizations that had roots in Reconstruction work became involved in the women as liberation movement of the 1970s. Women who had been rebel women passed on their knowledge and their experience to younger women who would take up the struggle for women's rights. This is an important pattern to understand. The women as liberation movements of the 1960s and 1970s were not created from nothing by young activists. They were built on the foundation of decades of women's work and women's organizing. They were built on the lived experience of millions of women who had proven themselves capable through their labor during and after the war. The young women marching for women's rights in 1968 or 1972 were standing on the shoulders of the rebel women of 1946, the environmental and ecological movements that emerged in the 1970s also had connections to women's as organizing during Reconstruction. As awareness grew about the environmental costs of rapid industrialization, women's environmental activism became important. Some of this activism was connected to concerns about workplace safety women. Factory workers pushing for safer working conditions were also, in some cases, pushing for environmental protection and accountability from industry. In Scandinavia particularly, women became prominent in environmental movements. Women who had entered the public sector during Reconstruction, working as teachers and nurses and social workers, became involved in environmental and social advocacy. They brought the skills of organization and advocacy they had learned during Reconstruction to bear on new issues. The point is that the skills and consciousness that women developed during Reconstruction were not limited to labor and economics. They extended into environmental politics, into social movements, into culture and education and public life. Women had learned during Reconstruction that they were capable of organizing society and solving problems. They applied that learning to the challenges that emerged in subsequent decades. Let's also think about the psychological and emotional dimensions of what happened during Reconstruction. Women who had lost husbands, sons, brothers in the war faced profound grief and trauma. They had to figure out how to survive and rebuild their lives in the aftermath of that loss. This was not just an economic challenge. It was a psychological and emotional challenge. For many women, work became a way of managing grief. It became a way of channeling their energy and their will to survive into something productive. It became a way of maintaining connection with community and with shared purpose. In this sense, Reconstruction work was not just economic survival. It was also emotional and psychological survival. It was a way of living through trauma and loss. The women who did this work clearing rubble, building new structures, creating new economic systems, were not just rebuilding physical infrastructure. They were rebuilding themselves psychologically and emotionally. They were rebuilding their sense of self and their sense of possibility. This dimension of Reconstruction is often missing from official histories. We focus on the economic and political dimensions. We do not focus enough on the emotional and psychological dimensions. But those dimensions are crucial to understanding what happened and what it meant. The women who emerged from Reconstruction were transformed people. They had been through horror and loss. They had survived by adapting, by learning new skills, by discovering capabilities they did not know they had. They had rebuilt their lives and their societies. And in doing so, they had become different people than they had been before the war. This transformation was not always easy or smooth. Some women were traumatized by what they had experienced. Some struggled with depression and anxiety. Some never fully recovered from the losses they had suffered. But others found meaning and purpose in the work of Reconstruction. Others discovered in themselves strength and capability that they had not known they possessed. Others built new lives that were more fulfilling and autonomous than the lives they had lived before the war. By the 1960s and 1970s, as Europe had rebuilt and as younger generations who had not experienced the war directly came of age, the full implications of what women had done during Reconstruction began to become visible. The younger women who had not lived through the war, but who had grown up in the Europe that women had rebuilt, began to ask, why do women still face discrimination? Why are women still paid less than men? Why are women still limited in what they can do? Why, when women have proven themselves capable of rebuilding civilization, are women still treated as secondary citizens? These questions, asked by a generation that had not lived through the trauma of war, had a different quality than similar questions asked before might have had. They had force because they were grounded in the lived reality of women's demonstrated capability. Women had built Europe. Women had proven themselves. And yet women were still facing discrimination and inequality. This was an injustice that became increasingly difficult to justify or ignore. The women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 1970s was, in many ways, the reckoning with this injustice. It was the moment when European society finally began to fully grapple with the contradiction between what women had proven themselves capable of and what society continued to claim women were capable of. This did not mean that all the demands of the women's liberation movement were automatically granted. Many of them were not. There were significant resistances. There were backlashes. Progress has been uneven and incomplete. But the fundamental shift happened. It became impossible to claim, after the 1960s and 1970s, that women were not capable of doing the work that society required. It became impossible to justify, on the basis of capability, the limitations placed on women. The only justifications that remained were prejudicial ones, and prejudicial justifications became increasingly difficult to defend. In the decades since, progress has continued, though with ups and downs. Women have entered professions and positions that were previously exclusively male. Women have become doctors and lawyers, and engineers, and pilots and business leaders. Women have become politicians and government officials. Women have become scientists and academics, and artists and thinkers. Not equally, and not without continued resistance, but progressively. This trajectory, from women being excluded from certain fields to women proving themselves capable in those fields during and after the war to women gradually gaining access and recognition and equality. This trajectory was enabled in its early stages by the work women did during Reconstruction. But we should be careful not to suggest that progress was inevitable or automatic. Progress happened because women fought for it. Progress happened because women organized and advocated and refused to accept the limitations placed on them. Progress happened because women, informed by their own experience and their mothers' and grandmothers' experience, demanded recognition and equality. The rebel women did not fight for women's liberation explicitly. They did not organize as feminists. They were mostly just trying to survive and rebuild. But their survival and their rebuilding created the material conditions that made women's liberation movements possible. Their demonstrated capability became the foundation on which later demands for equality could rest. This is an important dynamic to understand. Social change often happens in stages. First, circumstances force people to do things they might not have done otherwise. People prove themselves capable. That demonstrated capability becomes the foundation for later demands for recognition and equality. The demands are made explicitly by later generations, informed by what earlier generations proved was possible. In the case of European women and post-war Reconstruction, this dynamic played out over several decades. The rebel women of 1946 were not consciously making a revolution. They were responding to necessity. But their response to necessity created the conditions that made a revolution in gender relations possible. Now, in the early 21st century, more than 70 years after the end of World War II and the beginning of Reconstruction, the world has changed significantly. Women in Europe have rights and opportunities that would have seemed impossible in 1946. Women vote. Women work in every profession. Women lead businesses and governments and institutions. Women have achieved, in many areas, a degree of equality that would have been unimaginable in the immediate post-war period. But the story of how we got here, the story of the rebel women and the women who worked during Reconstruction, the story of women proving themselves capable and then demanding recognition for that capability, this story is often forgotten or minimized. It's not taught in schools. It's not celebrated in official histories. Most contemporary Europeans do not know about the crucial role that women played in rebuilding their continent. This is a loss, not just a loss of historical knowledge, though it is that. It's a loss of perspective and understanding about how social change happens. It's a loss of awareness about the capabilities that women have demonstrated. It has a loss of connection to the women who came before and who created the possibilities that contemporary women enjoy. By recovering and telling the story of the rebel women and the women of Reconstruction, we are not just correcting the historical record, though we are doing that. We are also reconnecting with a foundational moment in contemporary European history. We are acknowledging that the Europe we know today was built, in significant part, by women who proved themselves capable when circumstances demanded it. We are recognizing that women's liberation and women's equality were not gifts given by benevolent rulers. They were achievements fought for and built by women themselves, often in the face of significant resistance. This recognition matters. It matters because it reminds us that women have always been capable of doing the work that society requires. It matters because it reminds us that progress toward equality is not guaranteed and requires ongoing effort and vigilance. It matters because it reminds us that the achievements of the past generations of women should not be taken for granted. In the contemporary context, as Europe faces new challenges, economic crisis, political instability, climate change, migration, it is worth remembering what women were capable of in the aftermath of World War II. When faced with the literal rubble of civilization, women figured out how to rebuild. When faced with impossible circumstances, women found ways to survive and to create meaning. When asked to do work that had previously been considered impossible for women to do, women did that work. This is not to say that women should be expected to sacrifice themselves or to bear disproportionate burdens. But it is to say that women have capabilities and resources and capacity that society should recognize and support. It is to say that when women are given the opportunity and the support, they are capable of remarkable things. The widow's market of 1946 is gone now. The rubble has been cleared. The cities have been rebuilt. Most of the women who lived through Reconstruction have died. But their legacy remains. It remains in the buildings they helped construct. It remains in the economic systems they helped rebuild. It remains in the social possibilities they created by proving themselves capable. It remains in the contemporary Europe that women enjoy the freedom and the opportunity to participate fully in society. The story of the rubble women is the story of European reconstruction. It is a story that deserves to be remembered and told and retold, so that we understand how our contemporary world came to be, so that we understand that women built it, so that we understand that women proved themselves capable, so that we understand that the equality that women have fought for and partially achieved is grounded in women's demonstrated capability and proved potential. This is the true story of post-war European reconstruction. Not the story of American aid or political leaders or economic policies, though all those things were important. The true story is the story of women who faced the worst circumstances human society can create and who responded by rebuilding civilization. The true story is the story of women who proved what they were capable of. The true story is the story of women who changed what was possible for women in European society. Not through grand declarations, but through the daily work of survival and creation. The widow's market of 1946 was a place of desperate necessity. It was a place where women without resources had to figure out how to survive. But it was also a place of extraordinary capability and transformation. It was a place where women discovered themselves. It was a place where women proved what they could do. And it was the beginning of a transformation in European society that continues to unfold even now, more than 70 years later. This is the story that needs to be remembered. This is the story that needs to be told. This is the story of the women who rebuilt Europe. But there is more to tell. There are more stories. There are more dimensions to this history that need to be explored and understood. Because the story of Reconstruction is not just about the immediate post-war period. It is about a longer arc of change that extended well into the second half of the 20th century and even into the present day. Let's go deeper into what happened in the years after initial Reconstruction. By the 1950s, the most immediate work of clearing rubble and rebuilding physical infrastructure had been largely completed. Europe was being rebuilt. New buildings were going up. Factories were operating. Economies were beginning to grow. The acute crisis of 1946 had passed. But women's position in the workforce and in society remained contested and complicated. There were, across Europe, significant efforts to push women out of the workforce and back into the home. This was not uniform. Different countries took different approaches, but the pressure was widespread. The argument was that men were returning from war and needed jobs. The argument was that women should return to their natural role as wives and mothers. The argument was that normalcy meant restoring traditional gender roles. In some countries, this pressure was relatively successful. In West Germany, for instance, there were explicit policies designed to push women out of the workforce. Women were encouraged to leave their jobs. Tax policies were structured to discourage married women from working. Ideologies of femininity and motherhood were promoted as alternatives to women's work. But in other countries, women resisted this pressure more successfully. In France, despite cultural pressures to return to domesticity, women's participation in the workforce remained relatively high. In Scandinavia, women's participation in the workforce continued to increase. In countries under Soviet influence, Women's participation in the workforce was mandated by state policy and continued to be high. The result was a patchwork across Europe. Some countries saw significant decreases in women's workforce participation in the 1950s and early 1960s. Other countries saw women's participation remain relatively stable or continue to increase. By the late 1960s, however, a new trend emerged across Europe. Women's workforce participation began to increase again, regardless of what had happened in the previous decades. This increase in the 1960s and 1970s was driven by several factors. Economic growth meant that there were many jobs available, and employers were actively seeking workers. The feminist movement was pushing for women's right to work and women's equality in the workplace. Changing attitudes about women's roles, particularly among younger women, meant that more women wanted to work and to pursue careers. The cost of living was rising, which meant that families needed two incomes to maintain their standard of living. By the 1970s, women's participation in the European workforce was increasing visibly. Women were entering universities in greater numbers. Women were entering professions that had previously been closed to them. Women were organizing collectively for equal pay and equal treatment. The women's liberation movement was at its peak, and it was having real effects on women's opportunities and options. This is where we need to think about the connection between what happened during Reconstruction and what happened in the 1960s and 1970s. The women who came of age in the 1960s and 1970s, demanding access to education and careers and equal treatment, were often the daughters and granddaughters of the rebel women. They had grown up with mothers and grandmothers who had worked, who had proven themselves capable, who had shown them that women could do things that society said women couldn't do. These younger women were building on the foundation that had been laid during Reconstruction. They were saying, "Our mothers and grandmothers worked. Our mothers and grandmothers rebuilt Europe. Our mothers and grandmothers proved they could do anything. So why are we still facing discrimination? Why are we still being told that women's place is in the home? Why are we still being paid less for the same work? Why are we still being excluded from certain professions and positions?" These questions were powerful because they were grounded in lived reality. Women had proven themselves capable. Discrimination could not be justified on the basis of capability. It could only be justified on the basis of prejudice and tradition, and those justifications were increasingly difficult to defend. Let's think about a specific example. In Italy, women had become essential workers in factories during and after the war. By the 1960s, women were a significant portion of the industrial workforce. Women made up substantial percentages of workers in textile mills, food processing plants, chemical factories, and other industries. They worked for lower wages than men, but they worked. They proved themselves capable. They were essential to Italian industrial production. In 1970, Italian women workers, particularly in the industrial sector, began organizing for equal pay. They went on strike. They marched. They occupied factories. They demanded that women receive the same pay as men for doing the same work. These actions became part of a broader movement for workers' rights and social justice in Italy in the 1970s, known as the hot autumn of labor unrest. What is significant about this is that the women who were organizing in 1970 were not doing something new. They were doing what their mothers had done during Reconstruction, organizing collectively, demanding better treatment, fighting for their rights. But now they were doing it in a more organized way, with explicit feminist consciousness, connected to broader movements for women's liberation. The younger generation of women workers was taking the skills and the consciousness that had been developed during Reconstruction and applying them to new struggles. They were saying, "We have proven ourselves capable. Now we demand to be treated fairly. Now we demand equal pay. Now we demand equal treatment. Now we demand recognition for what we can do." And this was happening across Europe. In France, women workers in various industries were organizing for equal pay and better treatment. In Germany, women were entering the workforce in greater numbers and organizing for their rights. In Scandinavia, women were pushing for access to professions that had previously been closed to them. In Greece and Spain and Portugal, as those countries began to industrialize and as women entered the workforce, similar struggles were occurring. By the 1980s, significant legal changes had been made across Europe regarding women's rights in the workplace. Equal pay legislation was passed in most European countries. Discrimination in hiring and promotion was made illegal. Women's access to education expanded. Women began entering professions in greater numbers. Progress was uneven and incomplete. Women still faced discrimination. The wage gap persisted, though it was reduced. Women were still concentrated in lower-paying sectors and positions. But significant changes had occurred. The legal and social infrastructure of gender discrimination had been weakened. New possibilities had opened up for women. This is important to understand. These changes did not happen automatically. They happened because women fought for them. They happened because women organized and advocated and refused to accept discrimination. They happened because women drew on the experience and the consciousness that had been developed during Reconstruction to build powerful movements for change. Now let's think about some of the women who were involved in these struggles in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. Let's think about their stories and what they experienced. In France, there was a woman named Marie-Thérèse Equum, who became a prominent feminist activist and theorist. She wrote about women's liberation and about women's work. She was involved in organizing women workers. She pushed for legal changes to benefit women. She was part of the intellectual and practical leadership of the French women's liberation movement. But Marie-Thérèse Equum's activism did not emerge from abstract theory. It emerged from her own experience, working in the 1950s and 1960s as a journalist and intellectual, and from her observation of how women workers were treated in French factories and offices. It emerged from understanding that women were capable, but were not being treated fairly or recognized for their capabilities. In Germany, there were women who had come from families of rebel women. They had grown up watching their mothers or grandmothers rebuild Germany. They had internalized the knowledge that women were capable of building and creating. And when they came of age in the 1960s and 1970s, they carried that knowledge with them into the women's liberation movement. Some of these women were part of the more radical movements of the 1970s, the groups that advocated for revolutionary change, that were willing to use confrontation and direct action. Others were involved in more mainstream feminist organizations and movements. But many of them shared a common understanding that women had proven themselves capable, and that society needed to be fundamentally changed to acknowledge that capability and to create real equality. In Spain, after Franco's death in 1975, as Spain began to transition toward democracy, women became involved in democratic movements and in women's liberation movements. These women, many of whom came from families that had lived through the Spanish Civil War and World War II, brought with them the consciousness that women had survived terrible circumstances and had proven themselves capable. They brought this understanding into their activism for women's rights and for democracy. In Greece, as the country emerged from military dictatorship in 1974, women became involved in movements for democratic change and for women's rights. Again, women drew on the experience and consciousness of previous generations, women who had survived war and occupation and had proven themselves capable. The point is that across Europe, women's liberation movements of the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s were not abstract movements emerging from nowhere. They were built on the foundation of women's demonstrated capability during and after the war. They were led, in many cases, by women who came from families where that capability had been demonstrated. They were informed by the understanding that women could do anything, because women had already proven that they could do anything. Now let's think about what happened next. By the 1990s, women had achieved a degree of integration into European economies and societies that would have been unimaginable in 1946. Women were working in all sectors of the economy. Women were in professional and managerial positions. Women held elected office. Women were leaders of businesses and institutions. Women were lawyers and doctors and engineers and academics. But women's liberation was incomplete. Gender inequality persisted in various forms. The wage gap remained on average. Women earned less than men, particularly in certain sectors and professions. Women were still concentrated in certain types of jobs, teaching, nursing, social work, that were lower paying than other professions. Women still did more unpaid domestic labor and childcare than men. Women were still underrepresented in the highest positions of power in business, government, and academia. These inequalities reflected the fact that while legal discrimination had been largely eliminated, cultural attitudes and institutional structures that favored men persisted. Women had gained significant rights and opportunities, but full equality remained elusive. What's interesting to think about is how women responded to these continued inequalities. In many cases, they continued to organize and advocate, continuing the tradition of women's activism that had roots in Reconstruction. They pushed for more progress toward equality. They exposed and challenged discrimination. They created institutions and organizations to support women. They worked, in many ways, to complete the project of women's liberation that had begun, in its modern form, with the feminist movements of the 1960s and 1970s. In the 21st century, this work continues. Women in Europe continue to push for greater equality. New issues have emerged: questions about work-life balance, about childcare, about violence against women, about representation in leadership, and women continue to organize around these issues. The basic framework, though, remains connected to what was established in previous decades: the understanding that women are capable of doing any work, of holding any position, of participating fully in society. One thing that's important to note is that women's progress toward equality has not been linear. There have been periods of progress and periods where progress has stalled or even been reversed. In some countries, particularly those that underwent significant political upheaval or economic crisis, progress toward gender equality has been less consistent than in others. In Eastern Europe, for instance, after the fall of communism in 1989 to 1991, there was a period where women's position in the workforce declined. This was partly due to economic restructuring, as economies transitioned from centrally planned to market-based systems. There were significant job losses, and women were often hit harder than men. It was partly due to the restoration of traditional gender roles and conservative values that had been suppressed under communism. Women were, in some cases, pushed out of professional and managerial positions they had held. But even in this period of difficulty, women persisted. Women organized to defend their rights and their positions. Women entered politics in the post-communist transitions. Women sometimes gained more political representation than they had under communism, even as they lost economic position in other ways. This shows that the struggle for women's equality is not finished. It shows that progress cannot be taken for granted. It shows that women have to continue to organize and advocate to maintain and extend the gains that have been achieved. But it also shows something important about women's capabilities and resilience. Even when faced with setbacks and opposition, women continue to fight for their rights and their equality. Women continue to draw on the understanding that they are capable of doing anything that society asks of them. Even when society tries to push women back into traditional roles, women resist and continue to push for their full participation and their equality. This resilience and this refusal to be pushed back has roots in what women proved during Reconstruction. Women proved they could do the work. Women proved they were capable, and that proof cannot be undone. Even when society tries to deny it, even when women are pushed out of positions they have held. The fact remains that women have proven themselves capable. And women know this. Women carry this knowledge within themselves. And they draw on this knowledge when they organize and fight for their rights. Let's think about contemporary Europe for a moment. In the early 21st century, women in most European countries have significant legal protections against discrimination. Women have access to education at all levels. Women are present in the workforce at rates that are comparable to men's, though they often earn less and are concentrated in certain types of jobs. Women hold political office, though they are underrepresented in the highest positions. Women lead businesses and institutions, but inequality persists. And when we look at this contemporary inequality, and when we try to understand how to address it, it's worth remembering the history of how we got here. It's worth remembering that what women have achieved has been achieved through their own efforts, through their organizing, through their refusal to accept the limitations placed on them. And it's worth remembering that the foundation for all of this was laid in 1946 and the years that followed, when women, faced with impossible circumstances, figured out how to rebuild. When women proved, through their labor and their ingenuity, that they were capable of doing anything. When women created the foundation for a new kind of society where women's capabilities would be increasingly recognized and increasingly utilized. The rebel women of 1946 did not fight consciously for women's liberation, but they did something perhaps more important. They proved that women could do it. They proved, through their actions, that all the reasons society gave for limiting women, that women were too weak, too emotional, too intellectual incapable, too unsuited for hard work, were false. They proved that women could do hard physical work. They proved that women could manage complex projects. They proved that women could organize other people. They proved that women could create and build. And once something has been proven, once it has been demonstrated through the lived experience of millions of women, it becomes much harder to deny. It becomes the foundation on which future demands for equality can rest. It becomes the answer to anyone who tries to say that women are not capable of something. Women have already proven they are capable. Women have already done it. This is the legacy of the rebel women. This is what they left to future generations of women. Not just the rebuilt cities and infrastructure, though that's significant. Not just the economic systems and the institutions, though those are significant too. But the proof that women are capable. The lived reality that women can do anything. The knowledge that was encoded in the experience of millions of women who proved themselves capable in impossible circumstances. And this legacy has been carried forward. It's been carried forward by the women who fought for equal pay in the 1970s. It's been carried forward by the women who pushed their way into professions that had previously been closed to them. It's being carried forward now by women who continue to push for greater equality and greater recognition of women's capabilities. The story of the widow's market is not just a story about what happened in 1946 and the years immediately following. It's a story about how social change happens. It's a story about how women, through their actions and their struggles, have transformed European society. It is a story about how the capabilities that women have demonstrated have become the foundation for expanded rights and opportunities. But it's also a story that remains incomplete. Even now, more than 70 years after the end of World War II, full equality between men and women has not been achieved. There are still inequalities that need to be addressed. There are still barriers that need to be removed. There is still work to be done. And this is where the history of the rebel women becomes important for understanding the future. Because the rebel women showed us something. When women are given the opportunity to do work, women will do it, and women will do it well. When circumstances demand that women be capable, women rise to the occasion. When women organize together, women can create change. These lessons are relevant not just to gender equality, but to other challenges that society faces. When faced with economic crises, social upheaval, or environmental challenges, women have the capability to respond, to organize, to build solutions. The Rebel women showed us this. They showed us that women are not just capable of maintaining existing systems. Women are capable of building entirely new systems when the old ones have collapsed. This is a valuable insight as contemporary Europe faces challenges like climate change, economic inequality, and social polarization. Women have a role to play in addressing these challenges. Women have capabilities and perspectives and experiences that are valuable in thinking about and addressing these problems. Women have proven through history that they are capable of building and creating and organizing. These capabilities can be brought to bear on contemporary challenges. In conclusion, the story of the widow's market and the women who rebuilt Europe is a story about what happens when women are given the opportunity to prove what they can do. It's a story about how women, faced with impossible circumstances, responded by creating new possibilities. It's a story about how women proved themselves capable and how that proof is echoed forward through history, shaping what has become possible for women in European society. But it's also a story that needs to be remembered and told, because it's a story that has been largely forgotten. Most contemporary Europeans do not know about the Rebel women. Most do not know about women's crucial role in Reconstruction. Most do not know that Europe was rebuilt, in significant part, by women. This forgetting is a loss. It's a loss of historical knowledge. It's a loss of connection to the women who came before. It's a loss of understanding about how the contemporary world was created. By recovering and telling this story, we are not just correcting the historical record. We are also reconnecting with the foundational insight about women's capabilities. We are reminding ourselves and others that women have always been capable of building and creating. We are honoring the work of the millions of women whose labor and whose ingenuity rebuilt Europe after the devastation of war. And we are also reminding ourselves of something important for the future. When circumstances demand that women be capable, women rise to the occasion. When women are given the opportunity to do work, women do it well. When women organize together, women create change. These lessons from the past are relevant to the future. They remind us of what is possible when we recognize and support women's capabilities. The widow's market of 1946 is gone. The women who worked in that market are mostly gone now, having lived out their lives. But their legacy remains. It remains in the buildings they rebuilt. It remains in the economic systems they helped create. It remains in the social possibilities they created by proving themselves capable. It remains in the contemporary Europe where women have opportunities and rights that would have been unimaginable in 1946. And it remains as an inspiration and a reminder for future generations of women and for all of society of what is possible when women are recognized as capable. When women are given the opportunity to do the work that needs to be done, when women are supported in their efforts to build and create and lead. This is the true story of post-war European reconstruction. This is the story of the women who rebuilt Europe. This is the story that deserves to be remembered, celebrated, and used to inspire continued progress toward a more equal and more just society.